Good evening, everyone. It does look like the numbers have settled down. So just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Ed Ludlow. I'm running the technical side of things for tonight's webinar. No doubt we all know the drill of how these things work now. After the speakers, we will open things up to questions. Please do send your questions in via the Q&A window, and then we will invite you to unmute and ask your question to the panel. Just to make you aware, we are recording tonight's session and it will be made available online within the next few days, and please do share the link and spread the word. And I will now hand over to the chair of tonight's event, Sir Bob Neill.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thanks very much for giving us the run through on all the technical side of things. Always very grateful to you. Welcome to our latest webinar. It's one of a series that we're doing on topical issues for the Society now. I'm Bob Neill, I'm chair of the executive of the Society. And you can see the rest of the panel with me. Guy Sandhurst, or Sandhurst QC, is chair of the research committee of the Society. Our Pamela Thomas scholar for this term, Louis Flood. Great to see you, Louis. And my good friend and colleague from Parliament, William Wragg, chairman of the public. Oh, what's it? William, going to tell me? PACAC.
The PACAC is the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee.
I knew it was in there somewhere, but it's getting the right order. William's a fellow select committee chair, as you know. I share the Justice Committee chair, and mine's unabbreviatable, so it makes it a bit easier. But PACAC have actually just done a very interesting report in relation to the COVID legislation, which some of you may already have read. And if you haven't, I recommend it to you. And Louis has produced for the Society an excellent paper on the Westminster Parliament's response to COVID-19 and a comparison with the way perhaps our nearest comparator parliaments, those in New Zealand, Australia and Canada, the Dominion parliaments, children parliaments, some might say, the mother parliament in some respects, with very similar approaches and legal frameworks have dealt with the pressures that they have faced. So thank you very much for joining us, and we're going to start off with Louis talking about his paper and a number of the issues that flag up there. Then we'll move on to William and PACAC's report. Then they'll have a chance for a bit of a conversation, and then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions. So without more ado, Louis, over to you.
Thank you, Sir Bob. I'm going to kick off with a brief overview about how Parliament's responded to the pandemic. Coronavirus has affected day-to-day life this year. To protect ourselves and others from infection, we've all been asked to limit social contact and, at times, stay at home. Now, clearly, this poses a challenge for legislatures, which rely on parliamentarians gathering in one place to enact legislation, authorise public expenditure, and hold governments to account. But at a time of national crisis, it is also of importance that democratic oversight continues, particularly when the lives of thousands of people are at risk. Now, this has required the Westminster Parliament to radically alter its traditional ways of working by embracing virtual participation to ensure that parliamentarians can, insofar as possible, continue to fulfil their constitutional duties. Now, our Parliament was quick off the mark to adapt to social distancing. In the week preceding lockdown, both the House of Commons and House of Lords imposed caps on attendances, and non-essential business was scaled back. The Coronavirus Act, that is the emergency legislation granting ministers the powers to deal with the pandemic, was fast-tracked through both houses, and once royal assent was granted, Parliament rose early for the Easter recess. During this time, select committees were able to meet by video link, and parliamentary authorities examined proposals for virtual plenary sessions. When Parliament then returned from its extended break, motions were tabled in both houses that allowed MPs and peers to meet online. In the Commons, proceedings followed a hybrid format in which MPs could take part in business both in the chamber and remotely. Online voting was also trialled as a replacement for the division lobbies, which had been condemned by Public Health England. Clearly, social distancing can't be maintained with hundreds of people gathering together in a rather cramped room. The House of Lords adopted a slightly different approach. As the majority of its peers were unable to travel to Westminster, the average age of the upper chamber being 70, most of its business was initially held online. Once the technology in the Commons had been trialled and stress tested, the Lords also moved to a hybrid format. But remote participation would not be a long-lasting innovation in the House of Commons for all members. After the United Kingdom passed the peak of its epidemic and the country gradually began returning to work in June, the government took the decision not to renew the hybrid House. The revised arrangements in the Commons only permit members to participate remotely in scrutiny proceedings. These are departmental question times, urgent questions, and ministerial statements. Other aspects of the House's business, such as general debates or debates on legislation, take place in person. Members may also no longer take part in divisions electronically and instead must cast their votes in person, or alternatively, nominate a proxy to cast their vote on their behalf. Now, this is a point of controversy, as those members self-isolating or shielding on public health advice can only make limited contributions to the House's proceedings. However, on Sunday, shortly following the news that the Prime Minister was once again self-isolating due to COVID-19, the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, announced via Twitter that the government will bring forward a motion to allow clinically extremely vulnerable members to participate in additional categories of business. And earlier on today, Number 10 confirmed that the Prime Minister would be leading a debate in the Commons next week. So this may suggest that those self-isolating will also be able to take part in substantive business, i.e. general debates or debates on legislation. Now, of course, there are shortcomings of remote participation, which no doubt I'm sure will shed some light on. But the question that must be asked is whether it was reasonable for members, and by extension the constituents they represent, to have been excluded from proceedings in the House because they were unable to attend in person. Nevertheless, while Westminster's response to COVID-19 has been criticised, when compared with other Commonwealth parliaments, it's actually adapted remarkably well. Whereas the United Kingdom's hybrid parliament was fully operational back in April, for the most part of the pandemic, representatives in New Zealand, Canada, and Australia, the closest relatives of Westminster, if you like, only met online when in committee. While this allowed for oversight of the executive branch, members were unable to vote on or debate legislation without attending in person. It should be noted that this situation has now somewhat changed. The nature of New Zealand's epidemic meant that it's once again safe for parliamentarians to meet in person. And representatives in Australia and Canada have had the opportunity to contribute to plenary sessions through video links since August and September respectively. But what this does demonstrate is how quickly Westminster was able to adapt to the challenge of COVID-19, which itself is worthy of praise. Thank you.
Okay, Louis, thanks very much. That's very helpful. Let's move over to Will. But I think he and I both lived through some of these chops and changes, and I think you encompass it very well. It's interesting, the comparison, and I must say some of us have not had the chance to fully pick up on. So Will, tell us about the PACAC report and how that fits in with some of the things that we found in Louis' paper and your experience of the matter.
Well, certainly, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, Louis, thank you, Guy, for the opportunity to join you this evening and reflect on Louis' excellent report for the Society, and also tangentially at least link it to the report which my committee produced some time ago, which reflected upon the parliamentary scrutiny of the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, if I may, I'll come on to some personal reflections as a humble backbencher, how Parliament and its mechanism have operated in that time. Clearly, in March, if we cast our minds back to that different universe which we occupied in early March, and I think my own experience of being ill with COVID and going into isolation myself for 10 days and emerging from the isolation, had gone through the symptoms. On the day that the coronavirus bill received its stages and readings in the House of Commons, there was clearly a need for something to be done. And of course, with emergency legislation what you lose in scrutiny at the time, you hope to make up in accountability thereafter. And my committee has produced a report that argued quite strongly that we were not convinced that the Civil Contingencies Act might not have been a better vehicle for the government to use in dealing with this pandemic, not least from the perhaps narrow parliamentary perspective, in that it allowed greater scrutiny. It had a 30-day review mechanism as opposed to the 6-month review mechanism that we're afforded through the Coronavirus Act. And it also deals with many of the procedural matters which we've all become ever more familiar with, in terms of laying of regulations, the nature of the statutory instruments laid by ministers, and the chance parliamentarians have to scrutinise and indeed vote upon them. If you recall, what followed from this was the so-called Brady Amendment, second time in our parliamentary history when the chairman of the 22 has been called upon to bring forward an amendment to unify the Conservative Party in very different circumstances, admittedly. And indeed, reflecting on the previous Speaker's decision to accept an amendment, the current Speaker declined accepting that amendment, but nonetheless, such was the strength of Conservative backbenchers that the provisions of that amendment were agreed to by the government, which now give parliamentarians like Bob and I, who perhaps had the temerity to request a greater oversight and scrutiny of the matters affecting our constituents' everyday lives, it gives us the ability to at least have the opportunity to vote upon them before they come into force. And here we are, several months after the start of the pandemic, and that is the level of parliamentary accountability and scrutiny that we have achieved. But leaving aside the merits or indeed demerits of my committee's report, which I nonetheless commend to you, and reflect on life as a MP and our roles in Parliament during the pandemic, and also that of a select committee chairman. And it's fair to say that I've perhaps been on the troglodyte wing of the parliamentary party in apparent objecting to many kinds of innovation that we have seen. Notwithstanding Public Health's England's first inspection of our lobbies, at which they said it would be fine as long as we kept windows open. That moved to, of course, that nobody can go into the lobbies whatsoever, which perhaps is more of a reflection of the change of advice of Public Health England than it is parliamentary procedure. The most concerning aspect, I would say, of a virtual parliament is it is virtually nothing, frankly, compared to everyday parliamentary operations. When I think of the wonderful amount of technology that has been at our disposal and how it's used, what I want to know is not am I impressed by that, but do I think it actually performs the job of scrutinising the government? If I take at random an example such as an urgent question, there's nothing urgent about an urgent question anymore, because the minister and department have at least a day's notice if to make preparations. Not only that, but the order and the names of members who are going to participate is then published the evening before, so that the minister and their civil servants can prepare much more in advance than they would do for the ordinary and indeed spontaneous urgent question that might appear very early in the morning, with no knowledge indeed of which members might have been chosen. And if you think to how the mood of Parliament and the role of Speaker in creating that mood of Parliament can change. Previously, the Speaker would determine who they would call and which order they would do it in by means of members bobbing. That's gone completely. And instead, and if you speak to ministers, those candid ones among them will say what an easy job it is these days to come to Parliament. because they know exactly the order in which questions are going to come. Of course, their kindly PPSs will go around and make sure that they know as best they can what those particularly government members are going to question in the chamber. So that is one example. And I know there's going to be questions following to tease others, other examples out of me. But I will say one redeeming feature, because I'm trying to be fair, one redeeming feature of the virtual parliamentary setup is for select committee. I'd be interested to hear Bob's view on this as well. It is actually allowing us to bring together a much wider range of witnesses at short notice and at greater convenience for our hearings. I think myself of having somebody from Australia live on the committee when we looked at the need and nature of a public inquiry, and they're an expert in that field. Or I think the range of people that we had at last week's meeting, of those who've worked in number 10 as chief of staffs or of the policy unit, and have a great diverse range of people that we can bring in to our proceedings. And I think if any of you have followed select committee hearings, I think actually they have not been harmed at all by the use of technology. I think that's the redeeming feature of the virtual parliament. But I close on that positive note just to try and prove to you all that I'm not as curmudgeonly as might be assumed.
We'd never call you that, William. not at all. Well, no, I totally agree with you about select committees, I must say. I mean, I've found that something that has worked well, much the same reasons. It's actually probably helped us to get a better range of witnesses, and it's maintained a good level of participation by members, which has been a plus as well. So I think certainly in some respects we'll probably. I'm tempted to continue with that if we're able to thereafter, because one of the problems you have with a select committee, departmental one or thematic one like Will's, is that you can very often get the usual suspects in terms of the witnesses. It's quite, in our case, it's skewed quite heavily in favour of London-based institutions that will come give evidence to us, and this ability without having to plan in the diary in advance means actually we can respond much more quickly, I find, to getting people in from much more far-flung parts of the country in terms of what's happening. So I think that has been a plus. But for the rest, I agree. The spontaneity, which is an important part of Parliament's procedure, is gone. The inability, if you're participating remotely, to intervene in debates is a real problem. And that certainly limits the ability of members. Let's see how these new changes. But a bit bizarre, isn't it? It takes the PM having to self-isolate, by the look of it, for us to apparently get some movement around that. But there we are. Louis, you were going to have set off a bit of a conversation with Will about how you may see things.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things to draw out, really. I think the first one really is that over the past few days, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly from members that are shielding due to health conditions, that being unable to participate in debate has prevented them from fully carrying out their duties as a member of parliament, or that they might be second tier in some respect. I'd be interested to hear your opinion on what you'd say to those that say that they've been prevented from being properly and thoroughly represented in parliament.
I think important to say that is inevitably the case, that the nature of the pandemic will make an imposition on people, which is different depending on their personal circumstances. I think that's true of every walk of life and occupation. The question is, how do you adapt the proceedings of the House, which generally work, to suit the specifics of those other members' needs? And in my view, that should be done as far as possible without compromising the nature and the purpose of the House Commons. Now, I can understand the question will come back, well, surely they can take part in a debate remotely and virtually. But there is a danger in the nature of that debate that it becomes, a series of disjointed monologues. I suppose that maybe makes the assumption that most debates aren't ordinarily that in the Commons, which isn't always so. But it does become very difficult to have that organic flow that comes with being there physically. I think certainly virtual proceedings lend themselves quite well to those the different types of question sessions that are held in the chamber, but they don't necessarily work well for the purpose of the House of Commons.
Interesting. I think, and another quite striking feature of the current arrangements in Parliament, not so much a visible one, but it's in terms of voting. So there's been various ways that you've voted during the pandemic. You've had socially distanced queues. The Jacobitism of Conga, as one of them was described as, the voting app. But currently there's proxy voting, and the whips seem to have a huge number of proxies that they're looking after. So what is your voting? What's your opinion on these new proxy voting, and have you signed up for a proxy?
No, I have signed up, and I am in fact the proxy vote for two colleagues who clearly wish to entrust me with their votes rather than the government whip office. I can't possibly think why. But the deputy chief whip of the Conservative Party, who is an excellent chap, is also now the largest voting bloc at Westminster. He is in fact has upwards of last week, I think, 220 proxies, which you just have to hope that the deputy chief whip goes into the right lobby, otherwise the government is defeated immediately. But he's managed to do that. But I think in all seriousness, I thought it was quite interesting with some of the virtual voting that he won't mind me saying it, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer voted the wrong way, as I think did Harman at one juncture, which probably the Whip's office always knew that there was that problem, that members didn't quite understand what they were voting for, and you always needed the friendly whip on the lobby door just to make sure you go to the right division lobby. I happen to think that the proxy system that we have is probably the most workable short to medium term solution to the problem. But I would hope that those using the proxy system are doing it for the right reasons, such as those who by necessity must shield and have understandable family commitments like that, rather than those who think it just means that they can soap off early.
Interesting. Yeah. I think it'd be quite interesting to get your perspective, and maybe yours, Sir Bob, as well, as being a committee chair. You've both mentioned how remote proceedings have in a way benefited select committees, but have they also not hindered its work? For instance, under the current arrangements, committee chairs shielding can't make statements to launch reports by their committees, to lead debates on those reports, or to speak on legislation that their committees have scrutinised. So what's your opinion on that?
And let me give Will my view is I think that that's different. The problem there is not the proceedings in the committee, but that's proceedings in the chamber. So we're not inhibited in the way we conduct the committee meetings, but it's an inhibition because, as Will was saying, of the rules within the chamber that constrain our participation. That is, I think, slightly different, Louis. That's why I don't think there's a damage to what we're doing in the committee itself. But you're right. Our other work that we would do in the chamber, if you're somebody like Robert Halfon, for example, the excellent chairman of the Education Select Committee, has made the point that he is inhibited in that way. I would have thought it surely couldn't be beyond the wit of people to enable you to make a statement, committee statement in the chamber remotely. And I hope that we might think about debate. I have signed up for proxy voting, and that means that, as I noticed of a number of other people who are around now, I think the irony is, I take Will's point. Will's been very consistent in this, but the truth is the whips have been going around encouraging people to sign up for proxy votes to reduce the number in the lobbies. And the system has been progressively made easier and easier. Essentially, you self-certify that you want a proxy vote, same as you can for provided there is a public health reason. And the whips have said, oh, well, pretty much anything will cover it by and large, because it suits them to do that. Because, and it's one area where I do have a divergence of view, I think perhaps I'm honest, is the biggest problem is the lobby. The chamber is reasonably safe. I think they're spaced out. It's pretty sparse. You can handle the handovers. The area where the biggest risk of infection is are the lobbies, as Will said, they were condemned. In my book, the obvious thing is to do what the House of Lords did do, is actually go back to electronic voting. But because for some reason, the whips and the leader of the House are unwilling to countenance that, even though we've got the technology and the Lords do it perfectly well, the compromise is the proxy vote, which means you have chamber voting, but they keep the numbers manageable. I hope that's not an unfair way of characterising what's happened, Will.
I think that's completely fair, Bob, what you've said there. And indeed, there's a division called shortly. Bob will be able to carry on this seminar, and I'll have to go and cast my vote and for 2 colleagues as well. But we've got some time left yet, I think.
Yeah, I think we're okay. Yeah, but there's another bit of business first. Yeah.
Bob, can I ask a couple of questions which have arisen out of this? The first is on proxy voting. Does your proxy have to be a whip?
No, you can nominate anybody. Again, when the whips were encouraging people to take up proxy voting, they were encouraging you to nominate the deputy chief whip.
I can see that.
And I think that's probably been done on both sides. But it doesn't have to be. There are a number of other individuals who hold proxies, as Will is saying himself. He holds 2 others' proxies. He's not a whip. I think, in fairness, as far as I'm aware, the deputy has been scrupulous in voting according to instructions. And there is a system whereby if you want them to vote in a particular way, you text them and they do it. I know poor Stuart Andrew has had to walk into the opposition lobby on a couple of occasions to cast a proxy vote against the government for somebody who holds the proxy for.
And when he casts this vote, does he have to go backwards and forwards, in and out 10 times, or does he just say, I've got 50 of these?
He goes in and just gives the name of all his proxies, doesn't he?
No, he just goes through and nods himself and then says, and 220 proxies, and suddenly the tally rockets up.
The other question, which is a more general one, is that it strikes me, and I've been talking to 1 or 2 people about this, that when there is a significant matter, looking at the House, it's pretty empty because they're all scattered around, those who are there. Is it 50? Plus, of course, 120 on screens. But a minister is not under anything like the same pressure as he is physically in the bear pit when the House is full and people are going for him. So quite a lot is lost by that, isn't it? Yeah,
it's quite a sterile atmosphere, whether we use that word advisedly in this context, but it is fairly sterile. There's no real mood of the House, if that makes sense, which is often spoken of. Prime Minister's questions is, I would argue, suits the leader of the opposition particularly. I think he's in a reverential courtroom, if I could say this in this company as well, with the judge as the speaker, the dais above. So I think it has had certain consequences for different people's styles of how they might speak and how they might bolster themselves in the chamber.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's why in some ways I'd rather ease up within the chamber if we could, in some ways, and might compensate in terms of the voting rather than the other way around. But I do think that's I do think that's right. It is worth saying, just for the record on Guy's point, that the list of who holds whose proxies is all published, and you can find it in Hansard and online. So when he goes in and says 222 others, you can check who the 222 odd are. So it's all a complete mystery that comes up.
Oh, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Firstly, thank you to Will for voting against the current ludicrous measures earlier this year, and for joining the CRG. I think that's a great development. Two very quick questions. One, given how he's performed this year, do you still have faith in Johnson to continue as Prime Minister? And secondly, what will you do if the government continues to keep current measures in place and tries to extend lockdown on the 2nd of December?
Well, directly, yes, I've got confidence in the Prime Minister, and if they want to carry on with the status quo, I will vote against it.
Excellent.
Yep. And for what it's worth, Rory, I abstained on the vote on the basis I thought it was disproportionate. I applied the Bingham Centre's rule of law test to it, and it seemed to me it went beyond the evidence and beyond that which was proportionate to meet the evil. But because you can't amend SIs, the gist of my speech was I would have supported a more restricted set of proposals, but I couldn't for the life of me see any evidence around communal worship or around outdoor sports, for heaven's sake, and other things, so I declined to support it. And if they brought it back a second time, I will vote against it this time.
Just on the innovations on parliamentary procedure, it strikes me that it's an interesting time to have this, to have the changes introduced by the pandemic, not least because we have restoration and renewal coming down the tracks, potential decants. I wonder if you could crystal ball gaze slightly and speculate as to which changes we're likely to see surviving, which you would like to see survive, and those which you really don't want to see any longer than are absolutely necessary.
Thanks, Oliver. I would suspect some of the technological changes around select committees will carry on hereafter. We might see, and that's actually doesn't really impinge too much on R&R at all, really. Restoration renewal, because some of our committee rooms, particularly 5 and 6, are wonderfully grand Victorian rooms, would also have been fitted with very decent technology to allow these committees to take place. So I think they'll be adapted on that permanent basis. But I wouldn't suggest any changes to the chamber in the long term. I think Churchill's maxim, as it was after it was bombed out in the war, to try and keep it as much as possible like it was, with some slight improvements to the general accommodation. I think that will be how I'd like to see it continue.
Yeah, as they say, I agree and have nothing further to add.
I mean, well, one of the things which has struck me, looking at the COVID legislation and what's happened and unfolded, is that when you come to consider a statutory instrument, if you are allowed to, or at all, you're not actually told anything about the science or anything like that at all, or given any real detail. Now, is that really satisfactory 6 months in? It was understandable in March and probably even in May, June, but there's a lot of information there, presumably now, within the Department of Health. And shouldn't they be laying this information before us and before you, so you can say, this regulation really we don't think is necessary?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that many of the decisions and what's included in those measures are completely arbitrary. And if the minister had the confidence to say that they're arbitrary, then you could respect their honesty, couldn't you, for that, rather than what decimal point of difference it might theoretically amount to the R value across the country, which I have no idea how they extrapolate that information.
Yes.
One of the things that the PACAC report did say was that we would like to have an assessment of the science with each of these measures, and that's yet to be forthcoming, sadly. But I think certainly, I think it has been promised on the floor of the House for any regulations that will follow the current regulations, which of course expire on the 2nd of December. I would expect them to bring it forward. And indeed, if it had the good sense to do so, it might actually convince people of the argument they're seeking to.
Yeah, I think you're totally right.
I mean, there won't be, unless they lay some new ones, albeit on the 2nd of December, if that's which would be par for the course. There won't be any regulations at all, will there?
Yes, that's correct. They expire Cinderella clock, I think, between the 2nd and the 3rd of December.
Yeah.
I mean, well, if they're considering, they can either renew them in their entirety, effectively, or they can say we want to go back to a tier system. Now, if they want, there'd be absolutely no reason, would there, why they shouldn't say we are thinking of going back to a tier system as before. Can we have a debate about what you think should be in the different tiers and why?
That is not beyond the wit of man. You'll have to excuse me in a few minutes.
Okay.
My office is located near the chamber, so I can stay for a few minutes more and then test my practices of getting through the lobby. But I think you're quite right with the. It surely is possible to have a debate. I mean, thinking of the tiered systems that we had in Greater Manchester and the great furore that we had there, and then the strange things of negotiation in Merseyside and Lancashire, where one gyms could be open, the others they couldn't, and in one our boot sales could happen and in the other couldn't either. It seemed completely haphazard in that way. So I would hope that whatever measures are brought forward to replace the current ones, that we can have that debate and they can at least they can attempt at least to persuade us by showing us the evidence. Well, in the absence of questions, I wonder if I might go and vote shortly. But before I go and vote, I wonder if I might just thank you for the opportunity of joining you this evening, and for your engagement and your questions.
When we're able to go and have a drink in strangers together, or in the members' smoking room or whatever, we'll do that. But we're not allowed to do that even at the moment, because that's thought to be a bit too dangerous. We had the speaker come in virtually with a tape measure at one point to make sure people weren't moving the chairs too close together. And you just do wonder how much you have to treat people like grown-ups. But there we go. But Will, thanks very much. It's really appreciated.
Yeah, I'm sorry William Wragg's just gone. I was formerly the senior coroner in Stockport covering his area. And one of the things that concerns me is the consequential remainder or remaining secondary legislation, as it were, after the pandemic is over with, and we hope it will be over with soon. I'm thinking particularly of things like doctors being able to certify deaths of patients that they've never even seen these days. And having dealt, as I did, with the Dr. Shipman cases some years ago, I would hope that we never reach a situation by default where that sort of thing may occur again.
Yeah, I mean that's very timely actually. Observation, John, because wearing my select committee chair's hat, we've been taking evidence from the chief coroner, Judge Lucraft, this afternoon, together with his two deputies, because you probably know we're doing an inquiry on the coroner system at the moment. It was the last evidence session, and I think that's a very apt point. There is, as you know, there has been some emergency stuff, witnessing of wills and so forth, but at the moment, as we are under the current situation, the coroner still has to sit in court, even if it's with the coroner's officers to decide that he doesn't need to do anything beyond to have an inquest, but simply to be in 80% of cases where he can on the papers find the 4 statutory facts. But I do think we have to be very wary about all of that. There was some quite interesting evidence which will be up online, I hope within the next few days, on our committee's website about some of the pressures that the coroner system has had to cope with as a result of coronavirus, and has involved some difficulties, some changes to the working practices which have not been too easy to achieve. But I agree. I think we have to be very wary about removing safeguards, particularly for the vulnerable, where there's any risk of fraud or any other type of corruption of the system.
Thank you.
I was going to actually observe, Louis. I noticed your point about how, in effect, the Westminster Parliament hasn't done at all badly compared with some of the other Commonwealth and common law jurisdictions, and that sort of, from a lawyer's point of view, that's rather mirrored by the evidence we've had about the way the court system has responded. Although we get a lot of publicity around backlogs, particularly in the Crown Court, in the criminal jurisdiction, which is certainly the case. But interestingly, when the MOJ gave some evidence to us on our inquiry on the impact of COVID on the court system, it was that the High Court was operating pretty much normal, with an awful lot of distance work. That compared well with other jurisdictions. That Canada has, for example, not yet started jury trials again. And in fact, we have managed to start doing that. So in fact, we're doing pretty well with the other common law jurisdictions where we've got the jury issue to deal with. So that rather mirrors what's happening in Parliament. But the problems that we can see down the track are certainly in the Crown Court. The Magistrates Court is now actually eating into backlog, having built up. But there are some worries about the family jurisdiction. Again, you're okay in the High Court stuff, but some of the lower level family stuff is problematic. And interestingly, the tribunals have been much slower to move. Employment Tribunal in particular, and there's a different set of rules and practice rules that apply to the tribunals, which is interesting.
It's presumably easier where people are represented, as they will be in the Crown Court.
I think that's right, Guy.
So it's family proceedings or tribunal proceedings. One can see litigants in person and going to find it all very difficult.
Yeah, I think it is. That there's a real problem there building up. But again, it's interesting that the top level we have responded well and better than any others. But there's stuff coming down the track, and on the crime side, point that was made by both the Lord Chief giving evidence to us last week,
yes,
and by the Lord Chancellor when he gave evidence a couple of weeks ago, is that ironically one thing that has happened in the lockdowns, both the previous one and the current one, is that the police have actually been quite busy. And because the villains by and large have been at home, being surprisingly law-abiding, they managed to lift quite a lot off them. And they've been doing an awful lot of intelligence work, because a lot of the sort of the street crime hasn't been about. You know, there are far less muggings, there are far less offences of violence because nobody's out. There are far fewer burglaries because of fewer empty houses. So the cops have been getting on with the backlog, but we now have coming through the system a considerable number of very substantial multi-handed cases, which are likely to last some time. And they are concerned that that will clog up the Crown Courts. Because you can imagine if you've got 7, 8-handed trial, that's going to go on for 4 months, 5 months, 2 counsel for each side, for each defendant and the prosecution. Need a big jury panel, you know, in waiting and so on. The logistics of those are going to be pretty tough, and that could actually put us back into a worse, even worse position in the Crown Court. So any criminal practitioners here, try and get yourself listed as soon as you. I don't know if there are any practitioners here. We're finding stuff being criminal practitioners. We're finding stuff being listed in 2022 now if they are bail cases, which is pretty unsatisfactory, isn't it?
Yes.
Any
Right.
questions?
We got any more?
There are no hands up and no questions received in the chat.
Well, we'd ordinarily go to the Red Lion or somewhere, wouldn't we? We can't now, and you can't even go to your stranger's bar or wherever.
Yeah. The really bad news is that there's this real concern: will the Red Lion ever reopen?
Oh, are they going to do something with it, or knock it down, or turn it into a committee room or something?
Incorporated into the parliamentary estate.
That's what I thought. Yes.
So unfortunately, it was always going to be within this new sort of security perimeter that they want to put. So the idea is to advance all security gates in Derby Gate right up to the building line. But we'd hope we get a few more years of it before they ever got round to that. But the question mark with the lease falling in, or will it be financially viable? That would be a serious loss to many to many SPADs and researchers and
Indeed.
members of Parliament. That'd be very sad, wouldn't it?
Place.
Have you had any more update on that, Louis? Because I know you're still working in-house or working.
No, I haven't at all. They did show us a very nice diagram of it once as to where the barrier was going to go. But I think the prognosis of the red line is not good.
No, it's not. No, that's absolutely dire. Yeah, you're not allowed to get any alcohol in the members' dining room now either. So the Lord Chancellor and I have had to sort of not quite smuggle things in. We couldn't do that, so we have to sort of meet up in his room to have a business meeting.
I was going to say, are you allowed to take, your own bottle of hooch into your room?
In offices, provided we observe social distancing, which is the most important.
So you can sit there glugging by yourself.
Oh, you could do that. I think if the two of you are properly distanced, sitting on opposite sides of a room, you could do that. But are you working, Louis, or are you working remotely?
No, they've locked us all out, so we're all remotely at the moment.
Yeah, so none of my staff are in. So it's really just members and people who work for the House administration rattling around. The member staff are really not there at all to speak of. I think you have to get some sort of certificate, a letter from the Sergeant at Arms or something, don't you, to be allowed in for some urgent reason.
And has this had any impact on the plans for refurbishing the house, the building, the palace?
The palace, well, I mean,
and we still haven't settled yet whether you're going to leave, and if so, where to, and who'll go when, and so on.
Well, we passed legislation, if you remember, to set up this regional authority or whatever it be. But I think we still got to take the final decisions as to when it will be. And that time frame is a way off, wasn't it? But I suppose the question mark is, where's the money going to come from in the current climate? I think that's the biggest issue, because it comes ultimately from the public purse, and so I think it just adds uncertainty, Guy.
Well, if there are no more questions, we better not keep you, have we?
Well, it's good to chat to everybody, and thank you very much for organising this. Ed, thank you very much for doing the usual on the technical front.
Pleasure.
Very much in the paper, and I hope those of you who joined in, who are members, will do so again. It was a shorter one than sometimes, but it's an interesting topic. Have we got some more lined up, Guy?
Not at the moment, but we might fit one more in before Christmas.
Yeah. So have a look at the Society's website, and we'll have all the details up there. And if any of you are members, then can we just gently urge you to join? It's a very good deal, I promise you, because when we're back to doing physical functions, then I promise you we'll all be doing so.
Well, thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you for attending.
And thank you
very, very much for an excellent paper and for bringing William Wragg on.
Yeah, well done, Louis. Really good piece of work for the Society. Many thanks.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you, Ed.
Cheers, everyone.